Hello, I'm Eli Arnold, University Librarian and Director of the Philip Waltner Library here at Oglethorpe. I welcome and thank you all for joining us tonight for our third event in the year-long series of programming to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting suffrage to women. The library is coordinated with faculty and staff across campus to bring a full series of lectures, events, concerts, and more to help students and the entire OU community reflect on this landmark legislation. After tonight, our next suffrage event will be on Sunday, January 17th at 4 p.m. Then Drs. Wanda Young-Timko and Brent Runnels will offer a musical recital. Tonight, our Associate Provost, Interim Dean of the Hammock School of Business, and Professor of Mathematics, Dr. John Nardo, will introduce our speaker. Dr. Nardo.
Dr. Rhana Gittens is an Assistant Professor of Communication Studies here at Oglethorpe University. Originally from Lauderdale Lakes, Florida, she earned her bachelor's degree in journalism and an MBA from the University of Florida. She completed her PhD at Georgia State University. Dr. Gittens is a critical rhetoric and critical cultural studies scholar who researches identity, public memory, space and place, and media representation. She is currently working on a book focusing on cultural gentrification in the city of Atlanta and rhetoric's generative power for community and urban development. She has presented her research at conferences of the National Communication Association, National Council for Black Studies, and Rhetoric Society of America. Her forthcoming article, An Exploration of Aesthetic Communities and the Black Public Sphere in 2 Chainz' Pink Trap House, will appear in Theory and Events Journal in 2021. Her essay on Mariah W. Stewart's rhetoric appears in Southern Communication Journal. Tonight, Dr. Gittens will be offering us a talk titled, What If I Am a Woman? Mariah W. Stewart and Black Feminist Activism. There will be plenty of time after the talk for questions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rhana Gittens.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad you guys are able to join today. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to share my screen with you guys. So one moment here. All right, so thank you guys for joining, and thank you so much, Eli and Dr. Nardo, for introducing me today. So I'm going to be talking today, obviously, about Mariah W. Stewart. And as we discuss this, I want to kind of center you guys on the kind of the realm I'm coming from. So I'm a communications researcher, and so when I think of social change and suffrage and women's rights, I often ask the question of how do we persuade people toward these types of huge social changes? And so I'm coming to this from that perspective. How do we communicate for change, and how do we persuade social change? And I'm actually going to center us in the start of this and something more current. So I'm going to bring us over to 2018 and then bring us all the way back to 1830 with Mariah Stewart. But the goal here, as you guys listen to the story, Mariah W. Stewart's story, and learn about her rhetoric and speech making, is to also see and understand the Black women's rhetoric of today. When we look at suffrage, we want to, and women's speech, we want to reveal how women have successfully pursued suffrage and women's rights and the rights of the marginalized across the globe through the power of their voices to persuade and uncover the inequalities in society. And so what we're starting with today is really close to home with Michelle Obama. And so when I first started studying Mariah W. Stewart speeches, it was actually after watching First Lady Michelle Obama's Democratic National Convention speech in 2016. And many of you know this acclaimed speech where she described how she and her husband were teaching their children a family motto: when they go low, we go high. And as memorable and morally appropriate as that motto is, there were critics who saw the message as a call for civility, and they pondered the limits of civility, especially for Black women. And as Michelle described, she described examples of the belittling, the bullying, and dehumanizing she, her husband, and her 2 Black children endured on their road to and through the White House. Critics pondered the emotional toll of always being polite, always having to be benevolent and civil. And once more, why did Black women often center themselves on being the fortifying ground of American civility? And in some ways, they're doing that to forego the angry Black woman trope. And why are those a Black woman's only 2 categorizations? They're either civil or they're angry. So could tennis star Serena Williams, when she stands up and talks about how, or tries to stand up for the abuses or traumatic experiences she's had in regards to feeling like she's being treated as a cheater, and she talks to the refs about this, but in this moment, she's being labeled as the angry Black woman. So the question is, why are these the only 2 categories for Black women's speech? Is there something else going on here? One of the arguments against civility is that when you just say I'm sorry, you can, or sorry, when you say I'm sorry, or when you say it's okay for what you did, you can cover up the inequalities that you experienced. And one of the disagreements with being angry in a moment is that that becomes the dramatic moment that people pay attention to without really paying attention to what you were angry at, which is kind of what happened with Serena Williams. But I do not believe Michelle Obama was advocating civility and masking inequality, nor do I believe Serena Williams was being an uncivil, angry Black woman. Rather than differentiating between a Black woman's speech as being civil or uncivil, maybe there is something more commonly resonating on both of their speeches that makes them persuasive, something that mainstream media is not immediately recognizing. I argue that both women reflect a common African-American female rhetorical strategy that started long before they were born. My goal after hearing Michelle's speech was to unmask African-American female political rhetoric and the identities they create through that rhetoric. In what ways had African-American women developed a unique political strategy forged as a means for survival and liberation? So my goal today is to explore this African-American feminist rhetoric. And so in doing that, I'm going to take us backward 190 years. And so we're going here, we're going past Serena Williams in the US Open final. We're going past before Michelle Obama's DNC speech. We're going even before the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. We're going prior to Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech. We're going prior to 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the Seneca Falls Convention that started a lot of the talk about women's rights and suffrage. And we're going to 1830 with Mariah W. Stewart, where she starts her first political addresses to a community of Black and white audiences. And the reason why I start here with Mariah W. Stewart is because she is one of the first articulations of the intersectional identity of being African American and woman in politics. And she is a precursor to the suffrage movement and the inevitable tension that occurred between Black and white women suffragists as Black women began to recognize that the dominant feminist movement was not sufficient in tackling the unique Black female experiences. So who is this Mariah Stewart that I am referencing? Well, we don't have a picture of her. So if you go to Google her today, you will probably see an inaccurate picture, that misinformation we have out there, right? But whatever you Google, whatever comes up on Wikipedia, that is not her. So what I am showing here is kind of a moniker for Mariah Stewart is the cover to her first published pamphlet in 1832 called The Meditations of Mariah Stewart. Mariah was an essayist and a public speaker. She was the first political speaker or known political speaker with extant text of speaking in front of an audience of Black and white people. As she recounts in the Meditations publication, which is pictured here, she was born Mariah Miller in 1803 in Connecticut. She was an orphan by the age of 5 years old. She survived as an indentured servant for a clergyman until she was 15. At that time, during that time as an indentured servant, she attended Sabbath school. She taught herself to read and write. And eventually she moved to Boston and she worked as a domestic servant. In 1826, she married James W. Stewart. And so James Stewart was actually a wealthy businessman, a wealthy Black businessman at the time. He had actually fought in the War of 1812. And when they were married, she and James were living in a Boston city that was becoming a small, free, middle-class Black community. At the same time in this Boston city, someone else lived there. His name you might be a little more familiar with was David Walker. And so David Walker is an abolitionist who wrote The Appeal to the Colored Citizens. He fought for Black unity, a fight against slavery. And he also started a group in Boston called the Massachusetts General Colored Association, which was again focused on abolition. And Mariah Stewart, she actually joined this group. 3 years after she got married, her husband died, right? And after the death of her husband, she was left without anything. So remember, I told you he was wealthy, but the white executors of her husband's will used legal action to take her inheritance. So after his death, she didn't have anything, but what she did have was a little bit of the ability and freedom to be able to write and speak freely, right? Without having a husband or anyone over her at the time. So after his death, Stewart started writing essays for the Boston abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, whom you might also be familiar with. So William Lloyd Garrison started a newspaper called The Liberator, and he put out that he wanted to get more Black women to write for his newspaper. And so Mariah answered his call. She was confident that God had called her to be a warrior for God and a warrior for freedom. And so she launched a speaking career. It only lasted 3 years, y'all. And I'll tell you why. But through those 3 years, she published 2 essays and 4 speeches. While Mariah's work has been considered for the amazing way she crafts faith into political protest, my specific area of study seeks to find the African American female consciousness, the intersectionality that is in her work. And what I found in her rhetoric is a rhetoric of resistance, a resistance that is necessarily built in order to unify the many disparate and dissociative trends that make up the African American female's triple consciousness. So I call this a triple consciousness, taking from W.E.B. Du Bois, who calls a double consciousness of being African American, but in this case, her being African American and woman. And why is this a unique experience? Well, for Mariah specifically, and for all women that have to hyphenate their Americanness, the American repels the African repels the American, and the female repels the pure white Protestant female American. For Mariah Stewart, living in 1830, the abolitionist movement at that time, under William Lloyd Garrison and the Anti-Slavery Society, was actually seeking, of course, to end slavery, but then what do you do with all the Blacks? And at that time, they decided, well, we'll move all the Blacks back to Africa. And so she's dealing with a situation where she's not being considered American. in order to stay. She's being told, go back to Africa, a place she's never seen, a place where she does not know the language or the people. And so this identity is repelling each other, right? That the Americans don't want her to be American, and then they're also dehumanizing her Africanness. At the same time, being a woman during this time, of course, she has the issue of just not being a man, but also being a Black woman, she has been defeminized, right? She is being compared to the prototype Protestant, pure, true womanhood of that age. And this was a pious womanhood that was expected of women during the 1800s. But Mariah wanted to talk. At the same time, she's a widow, she's unmarried, she does not have children, right? So at this time, that's what women were supposed to be doing. So she was unmarried, she was unchildbearing, and now she wants to talk, right? So these are all the things that she's working against in trying to be this African-American woman political speaker. Now, through a rhetorical analysis of all of Stewart's essays and speeches, we find that over the 3 years, she was actually able to form a unique rhetorical strategy of rearticulation and resistance to finally confirm herself and Black women as sacrificially American through oneness with America, nobly African by history, and divinely feminine by God, reflecting that no man could define them. So in the rest of this lecture, I'm going to review some of the key ideas of respectability politics that constrained Stewart's speech. Then I'm going to review excerpts from her essays and speeches chronologically to show you her movement from respectability politics to anti-racist declarations for resistance. And lastly, I'm going to connect all of this back to Michelle and Serena's rhetoric. You'll notice in this lecture, if you go to read the adjoining essay, that I've taken out some of the rhetoric theory and jargon that I use in the essay in order to make this more accessible to the larger audience. So for comparisons, if you notice that, that is why those differences are there. All right. So the first word we want to look at is respectability politics. So Stewart has been studied as a mainstay in scholarly research on Black feminist rhetoric, but much of these studies categorize Stewart's rhetoric as advocating respectability politics, or the term I used earlier, civility. This term was originally coined by Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. It's also called moral suasion, short for moral persuasion. It's the theory that presumes that the more closely Black people model whites in their habits, the more respectable they will be to white culture and ways of civilization. They'll be more liked, they'll be treated equally, and less likely to be prejudiced against. It's today largely regarded as a failing form of resistance because it places the burden of equality on the victim, making it the job of Black people to remove racist opinions by assimilating to white consciousness. Now, for Mariah Stewart, not following the rules of respectability politics was not going to be that easy because, as I told you before, she was working with William Lloyd Garrison in the abolitionist movement, which had a huge focus on this form of persuasion to get to get more people involved in the abolitionist movement. They were often telling Black people to be respectable. So you see here some excerpts here. Garrison pressed for free Blacks to challenge every law which infringes on your rights as free Native citizens and to respect yourselves if you desire the respect of others. They had acquired and would continue to acquire the esteem, confidence, and patronage of the whites in proportion to your increase in knowledge and moral improvement. Garrison urged Blacks to acquire money too, because money begets influence and influence respectability. So Garrison worked under the respectability politics presumption clearly, and the thought that the more closely Blacks modeled these habits, the white opinions would change. On the other hand, Today, African Americans largely advocate an anti-racist strategy, which many of you here have heard before. Often the big proponent of this being Ibram Kendi, who contends that people should be treated equal simply because they are human. It rejects racial oppression and understands that good and bad are a part of all forms of humanity. Righteousness and evil can be found in every race. Thus, there's no room for superiority in any race. And it's not the fault of anyone else or to try to get you to no longer be racist. It's each of our choices to no longer be racist. So now the question becomes, when we think of the constraint that Mariah has being a part of this abolitionist movement, if Mariah is in this structure that advocates respectability politics and has many principles that would say she shouldn't speak publicly, what does she do to be persuasive? What does she do to form an identity and advocate anti-racist ideas? Well, my research shows that, like Michelle Obama, Stewart was becoming. She actually became right in front of everybody. Her rhetoric shifts as time passes, and she realizes the flaws of respectability politics and uncovers them. She does it using a process called re-articulation that Patricia Hill Collins, as well as Omi and Wynette in sociology, have both discussed in their books as well. And so what re-articulation is it's a conscious method that corrects the failures of old principles. So in this, you take the principles, rules, and definitions of dominant society, and you reimagine and define them for an African-American woman identity. You consciously reveal the issues with the principle. So in this case, we're talking about respectability politics. So she slowly reveals the issues with respectability politics, and she is able to not only resist using respectability politics, but tell everybody else why this is bad. Black women can never wholly be just American when many American ideals are historically set to dehumanize their African identity. And in addition, they can never be just African when by blood and by land they have a true American identity. And Black women, as the female gender, contend with the prejudice of both not being white women and not being men. But you cannot wholly separate yourself from any of these three identities, just like she couldn't completely separate herself from respectability politics. But because of these contradictions, she had to find ways of re-articulating, defining her identity for herself in order to resist those external pressures. And so we're going to see that next. I'm going to take you through what I have categorized as three large movements over time in Mariah Stewart's speaking that help us to see how she re-articulated some of those original principles and started to define herself for herself. So the first step she took, and this is, we're also going chronologically in time here, so these are her very first essays. Stewart starts to make an argument for American consciousness of Black women and men, and also using the respectability politics principle here. So first, in her first essay in The Liberator, this was written October 1831. It was written, we got to remember her audience, she's writing to Blacks and white readers who are interested in abolition. And when she specifically directs her conversation to her Black audience, Stewart writes, "Prove to the world that though black your skin as shade of night, your hearts are pure and your souls are white." So this is a clear use of respectability politics. In this, she urges her kin to prove they are American by changing their character or altering their character, making sure they're always being ethical and immoral according to the word of God. Now, in the same exact essay, she also makes a call for freedom from slavery, and she does so by explaining why Black people are American. She writes, then why have not African sons the right to feel the same? Are not their wives, their sons, and their daughters as dear to them as those of the white man's? We will not come out against you with swords and staves as against a thief, but we will let you know that our souls are fired with the same love of liberty and independence with which your souls are fired. We will tell you that too much of your blood flows in our veins, too much of your color in our skins, for us not to possess your spirits. She says, Blacks have enriched the soils of America with their tears and blood. So in this, she makes the claim that Black people are American. They're American because they're one with white Americans as well. We're a part of this land. We're a part of you. We have the same blood as you. We've sweated and toiled in the same soil. Thus, they are American. So, and even though she's using respectability politics in order to get Black people to convince the rest of the world they're American, she's also still making a claim that we are one, right? And so she makes her point here about her American identity. So the next step that she takes the next year is she starts to make an argument for also being African. And she does this through slow rearticulation, but you're not going to see that too much in this first quote. So in her spring 1832 lecture, she makes a lecture to the African American Female Intelligence Society. And here she uses respectability politics. She reminds the women to teach their sons to be ethical and educated. She urges the women to have firmness of character, and she refused to believe that racism was a problem in America. So using the Haitian uprising as an example of what Black people can be, she also showed that she was saddened by the current state of Haiti. And she says to them, and why is it, my friends, that we are despised above all the nations upon the earth? Is it merely because our skins are tinged with a sable hue? No, nor will I ever believe this. And so what she's saying here is we're not despised just because we're Black, which means she's saying we're not despised because they're racist. We're despised because, and as she continues, she's saying we're despised because we do not have a firm godly character, right? So at this point, she still believes we're just not respectful enough. That's why we're being despised. But then she makes another speech just a few months later in September 1832. And this is one of her most popular speeches. And it was this is the first time a woman of any race in the United States, at least, has spoken to a Black and white male and female audience. So what they would call at that time a promiscuous audience. And in this speech, she takes a biblical verse about lepers standing outside the town gate. So lepers, people with leprosy, a disease, they weren't allowed inside the town, so they would stand outside the town gate, and they were waiting for someone to bring them food. And Stewart asked her audience, making a comparison of the Black people to these lepers, she says, why sit ye here and die? And what she's saying is she's saying we're sitting. Everything we're doing right now, it's not doing anything. It's not making any change. She's realizing that as she continues in her speech, this respectability politics, this assimilation stuff, it hasn't changed a thing in the year that I've been speaking. She goes on and she starts to make examples of why she thinks it's not changing anything. And she says, I've been having conversations with white women who own businesses. And she's asked them if they would hire respectable Black women. And they told her no. And so she was like, even though they've done all these great things, these women are still saying they won't hire them. And this is where she's starting to realize this respectability politics stuff, not really working. In this speech, Mariah confirms what she believes to be the real reason for Black servile position, and that was prejudice, ignorance, and poverty. And so this is where she begins to separate herself from the respectability politics of the anti-slavery society. And she uses rearticulation to invigorate the Black audience to resist oppression by becoming educated and continuously working toward freedom. And then 5 months later, in a speech to Black men at the African Masonic Hall, she makes a completely anti-racist appeal regarding the African consciousness. And this time, instead of me reading it, I actually would like you guys to hear a reading of an excerpt from this speech from Kerry Washington. So let's try to get that up for us. One second.
In the year 1833, when the anti-slavery movement was just beginning in the United States, an African-American woman, Mariah Stewart, gave this speech.
Most of our color have been taught to stand in fear of the white man from our earliest infancy, to work as soon as they could walk, and call master before they scarce could lisp the name mother. Continual fear and laborious servitude have in some degree lessened in us that natural force and energy which belong to man. Or else, in defiance of opposition, our men before this would have nobly and boldly contended for their rights. Give the man of color an equal opportunity with the white, from the cradle to manhood, and from manhood to the grave, and you will discover the dignified statesman, the man of science, and the philosopher. But there is no such opportunity for the sons of Africa, and I fear that our powerful ones are fully determined that there never shall be. Oh, ye sons of Africa, when will your voices be heard in our legislative halls in defiance of your enemies, contending for equal rights and liberty? Is it possible that for the want of knowledge, we have labored for hundreds of years to support others and been content to receive what they chose to give us in return? Cast your eyes about. Look as far as you can see. All is owned by the lordly white, except here and there a lowly dwelling which the man of color, midst deprivations, fraud, and opposition, has been scarce able to procure. Like King Solomon, who put neither nail nor hammer to the temple, yet received the praise, so also have the white Americans gained themselves a name, like the names of the great men that are in the earth, while in reality, we have been their principal foundation and support. We have pursued the shadow. They have obtained the substance. We have performed the labor. They have received the profits. We have planted the vines. They have eaten the fruits of them.
All right. So there we really get a chance to see Mariah do a complete flip to anti-racism. And it's a special moment for all of us. So now I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint slide. Pause for this pause again since we had some tech issues. All right. So in this particular segment, we see where Mariah again has made that complete turn to telling us a little bit more about herself, removing those racist appeals about respectability and saying, no, we are humans too, and we deserve these rights. Later on, a few years later, or sorry, just a few months
Beginning
later,
in the United States,
she makes another shift. And this is where she starts to make an argument for the feminine. And she specifically talks about being a woman, and that's where the title of this speech comes from, or this lecture comes from, of What If I Am a Woman? In this particular speech, she re-articulates the biblical principles. She says that Black women are curious and complete, that the standards of womanhood are beset upon Black women to be treated equally. And she says Black women have a divine consciousness. She declares women are provided with wit, talent, and genius. And she does all of this in her very last speech. So this is her farewell address. She's done with this whole situation. It's a really sad and somber speech. Over the 3 years that she had been speaking, she was dealing with opposition, not just from the white people. She was experiencing it from Black people as well. People who believe she should not be speaking because she's a woman, and to people that were even, of course, upset about the movement for abolition. And then her discussions about religion. And so she got a lot of opposition, but in this final speech, in her farewell address, she makes a point at the very end to empower other women. This is how the speech starts to conclude, as she says she doesn't want other women to give up in some ways the way she may have. And so we'll hear a short snippet from that, and hopefully this one works.
What if I am a woman?
And this is actually Ruby D saying this excerpt.
If I am a woman, is not the God of ancient times the God of these modern times? Did he not raise up Deborah to be a mother and a judge in Israel? Did not Queen Esther save the lives of the Jews, and Mary Magdalene first declare the resurrection of Christ from the dead? Again, holy women ministered unto Christ and the apostles, and women of refinement in all ages, more or less, have had a voice in moral, religious, and political subjects. Again, why the Almighty hath imparted unto me the power of speaking thus, I cannot tell. But to convince you of the high opinion that was formed of the capacity and ability of women by the ancients, I would refer you to sketches of the fair sex. Read to the 51st page, and you will find that several of the northern nations imagined that women could look into futurity, and that they had about them an inconceivable something approaching to divinity. A belief that the deity more readily communicates himself to women has at one time or another prevailed in every quarter of the earth, not only among the Germans and the Britons, but all the people of Scandinavia were possessed of it. Among the Greeks, women delivered the oracles. The respect the Romans paid to the Sibyls is well known. The Jews had their prophetesses. The prediction of the Egyptian women obtained much credit at Rome, even unto the emperors, and in most barbarous nations. All things that have the appearance of being supernatural, the mysteries of religion, the secrets of physic, and the rites of magic were in the possession of women.
And so there she's in her final address and telling the world that women, and of course using her biblical standpoint, that women were endowed to speak. In this, she re-articulates the common biblical principles as a way to empower the women that will come after her to continue to speak, and then also trying to persuade others of why women's speech is important. In the end, what Mariah W. Stewart does for African American women is she brings together those three items: the African, the American, and female. She starts off with respectability politics and realizes this is actually repelling who I am. I can't be who I am if I use respectability politics. And slowly but surely realizes that in order to be this full human, African American and woman, she had to resist those rules and principles that told her that she was not enough. And in doing so, she expressed all of that publicly to the rest of the world. And so today, when we think about Michelle Obama and Serena Williams, and in the beginning of this, I told you, we've put these two in a box, right? And we say, Michelle is civil, and Serena, at least in this and her episode, that she was being an angry Black woman. But what I say is it was not the civil and the angry Black woman that we were seeing in Michelle and Serena. Instead, they both re-articulated the rules as a form of resistance and unveiling of the inequality of their situations. For instance, Michelle Obama tells her family to go high when others go low, so that the world will recognize the incivility of the attacks against their humanity. At the same time, Michelle defined herself as going high. She named herself. On the other hand, Serena Williams passionately calls for a ref to apologize for insinuating that she had cheated, uncovering the disparity between men and women's treatment in tennis and all sports. At the time, Serena defined herself as a woman with integrity. She named herself, and she wouldn't let anyone name her something different. I use these two examples, one clearly political and the other maybe not so much off front, but I use them to reflect how the rhetoric of resistance indwells all of us and all women, especially those that have those hyphens. And these speeches are used to form identity, to name yourself, and to change the world. In the end, I do this to show how these women have been able to persuade and uncover the inequalities in society and make themselves whole in their own magical ways. And that is it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gittens, for telling us about Mariah and her contribution to Black feminism and connecting it to Michelle Obama and Serena Williams. That was just, that was great. So set aside for a conversation. So please unmute yourself and ask any questions of Dr. Gittens. Or put in the chat if you don't want to, say it yourself. Feel free to do that. But we have about 10 or so minutes set aside for chat. So please.
Should I kick us off?
Go for it.
I've been kicking this question around in my head, and I don't know if it's going to come out right, but okay. So at the end, you talk about this rearticulation of biblical principles. So I'm curious if you think that Christianity and the use of the projection of a Christian identity is a piece of respectability politics, because I think Kendi talks about this really well in his book, right? In terms of like how Christianity was really uses as like assimilationist weapon, right? And so, I mean, but she's writing in 1833. So that's like, this is 200 years removed from like Cotton Mather and people like that. And so I'm curious if you think about and read these speeches as if invoking Christianity, it's part of respectability politics, or are you saying that, well, maybe I should just stop there? Is that what you?
I get your question. I think she's doing, it's both. So original intent was to use the biblical idea of womanhood and read the Bible as saying why women should be submissive, why they should be pious, right? And so what Mariah did and what many other women did was they reread the Bible for themselves and said, well, I see examples here where women are, being really powerful and they're getting leadership opportunities and they're speaking up. And so they are re-articulating the reading in many ways. They're reading it for themselves and finding that women can also be empowered by the Bible and not just being told to submit through the Bible's words. I think Jay has his hand up.
A lot of your emphasis about her action and criticism of it dealt with her as a speaker. So I was wondering, is there a difference between being an oral speaker in these 3 years and writing, or are they are sort of similar? But it seemed like what I got from your lecture was that what was particularly challenging norms was the fact to go out publicly and speak.
She doesn't know, like in her that final farewell address, she doesn't necessarily know a differentiation between whether the retaliation against her was versus her essays versus her speeches. I would say, just assuming during that period of time, what made her stand out was the fact that she was publicly speaking in front of a group of Black and white people. So it, more than anything, for her, just gave a larger emphasis, or people were zooming in on her more. Because of that aspect of her lifestyle. In regards to like when she would speak to just groups of women, so she has the one speech that is just to groups of women, that wasn't as controversial because women at that time, they had groups, right? And they were able to speak with each other. So it really becomes more of an issue where she's speaking to multiple genders and multiple races.
What happened to her after 1833?
Oh, good question. So after she steps down, she moves to Washington, D.C., and she actually started a Sabbath school close to the Freedmen's Hospital. So this was a hospital for free Black people in DC. And she started a Sabbath school there. She had students actually from Howard, I think, helped teach there. And the reason why we know that is because the pamphlet called Meditations of Mariah Stewart that I kind of showed you in the very beginning there, she republished it in 1879. And it has like a preface where she kind of says some of the things she's been doing. And also it has letters from people. She's trying to get her pension. She's trying to get her pension and her inheritance that her husband left her. And so she has people write letters to prove that she had been married to him and all these things. And so when she republishes the meditations, she includes all these letters that people had written trying to prove that she was actually married to James Stewart. And within those letters, you start to see the rest of her story and the things she did after she stopped speaking publicly.
Cece, I think you have a question.
It was more so of a commentary. I just wanted to say I really do appreciate the fresher perspective. I know, especially nowadays when you look at feminism, even if it's portrayed from a person of color, it's going to be Betty Friedan. That's what people are going to go to immediately. And it's nice to learn new things. This is something I never even heard before. And it's nice to learn not only about another person of color outside of a white woman recounting the history of feminism, but also showing how it affected the African-American groups as well. I really enjoyed that perspective, and I really am glad I can relate to something like that. So thank you. This was really inspiring.
Oh, thank you, Cece.
I have one more. So she published through 1879. So she lived to see the end of slavery. And then, of course, Reconstruction and Jim Crow. But did she write any of her, kind of reflections of the institution of slavery may be over, but of course, we know that, other things took its place. But did she write anything about that or reflect on that?
From what I've read, I don't recall that she did ever reflect on that. which would be interesting if she had.
I'll ask another one. How well known is she today, and did she sort of get rediscovered at some point, and who was responsible?
Very good question. She isn't that well known today, actually. So she's been researched by a few different people, but I would say, I believe her name is Marilyn Richardson. Her last name is definitely Richardson. She actually wrote and compiled all of the lectures and essays that she written, the things that were in the Book of Meditations, and she compiled that into a small anthology of Mariah W. Stewart, and that has really helped with getting more information about her out there. In regards to the field of rhetoric, she was actually added to the rhetorical tradition I think within the last 10 years of publication. I could be wrong about the years there, but she was recently added as a Black female speaker to that. And so that has helped get her name out there, at least in the communications field. And then you have small mentions of her. She's one of those names that when you're reading about people that were involved in women's rights in the 1800s, where, they'll just list out Sarah Grimke, Sojourner Truth, and they'll do a whole list with commas, and she might be one of those in that serial list. And so unless you really notice it, it might not be something that you're immediately like, well, let me look her up. I haven't heard of her before. But she's sometimes in those serial lists of people that were involved in the 1800s. I think there was one in the chat. From Gail, name yourself intrigued me. How can we do that now? And who is a public example? Good question. So I think that people are naming themselves now for sure. So I give you that example of Serena, as well as Michelle in this case, of people who have decided to tell you exactly who they are and who they want to be. Would be the two examples that I'm using here. And how can we do that now? So I think that people are doing it every single day. I see students doing it in my classes, where they're saying what their beliefs are, and if someone disagrees with them, they're saying, nope, that's not me. So I think people are doing it through their writing, through their talking every single day.
Thank you. Do we have time for maybe one final question before we close out? And if not, Gail's question was a good one to end on. Well, perfect. Well, thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.
The support in this was such a fascinating presentation. I know the rest of the night I'm going to be looking up Mariah, learning all I can tonight, and see what we should have in the library, and what books I can buy. So
awesome.
So again, just want to thank everybody and remind you our next event will be Sunday, January 17th at 4 o'clock. Will be a musical recital, and I hope everyone has a good night. Thank you.